Hey folks, and welcome back to another Dev Influencer Show. I'm your host, Charles Max Wood. If you're interested in becoming a Dev Influencer, go to devinfluencers.com/apply. I'm just going to dive right in. This is probably the best why to become a Dev Influencer podcast I'm going to do. So the last two have been about that. The one has been basically the long-term why you should become a Dev Influencer. The other one was kind of short-term rewards for becoming a Dev Influencer. And this one is just going to be, hey, why it's awesome to have an audience that you have served well. Okay. And I kind of want to back up and just really talk about why this one's my favorite. Okay. Because, I mean, it's fun to talk about, hey, I had Microsoft, or I had my friend Richard contact me and say, hey, Microsoft wants you to come out to the conference, right? And then, have them pay my hotel and all that stuff, right? I mean, that's cool, right? It sounds cool. It's fun to brag about. But let me tell you, nothing beats going and sitting down with somebody and have them tell you that you changed their life. Okay? I mean, nothing. So I remember it was actually our first Microsoft build, speaking of bragging about going to a conference, right? So we're out in San Francisco. They flew AJ from JavaScript Jabber, and then they flew Andrew and James from iPhreaks and I out to, so I was pulling double duty because I was there for both shows, out to San Francisco. And we decided to just post something for a meetup and just see who showed up, right? So we had 2 or 3 people show up. We just did it upstairs at this bar, which is funny because none of us drink except for James. So we're sitting there in this bar and we had a few people show up, and this guy shows up, and I don't remember his name. I really wish I did, but he shows up and he sits down and we're just kind of gabbing, and he starts talking to us about getting into coding, and he'd gotten into coding a year or 2 earlier. And before that, he'd been working construction, and he had decided that he was going to make this career transition. The thing that had kind of gotten to him, there were a couple of things, but he had just had a son, and he didn't really care for the area of the San Francisco Bay Area that he was living in, and he wasn't making a whole lot of money, so he didn't really have a whole lot of options as to where he was going to go or what he was going to do. And anyway, for whatever reason, he decided to get in and actually start learning how to code. And so he starts learning how to code, and somebody turned him on to JavaScript Jabber. And so he starts listening to JavaScript Jabber. And after a few episodes, he goes back and he listens to the entire back catalog of JavaScript Jabber. And at the time, that was still, a couple hundred episodes. And I'm just like, dude, every time somebody tells me that, especially now, because we're getting up to like 500 episodes of Ruby Rogues, right? I'm just like, glutton for punishment. Holy cow. I mean, that's a lot of content that you go back and listen to, right? And so he's like, yeah, but it made a major difference. It made it a whole lot easier for me to learn this stuff, because a lot of times I'd be trying to figure out a particular idea that I was coding, and then you guys would explain the same idea on the podcast, and it would make it click in my head, right? And so even though we weren't actually showing code, right, because it was audio only, even though we weren't showing code, even though we weren't demonstrating particular coding techniques, we were explaining concepts behind the code. It was enough for him to go, oh, that's how that works. And then the stuff would come together, and that would be the thing that would get him over the hump. But it wasn't just that. Then what would happen is then he would go to these coding job interviews, and they would ask him a question, and he's like, I swear, like 75% of the time they'd ask me a question and I knew the answer because I'd heard it on the podcast. And we're like, well, that's kind of cool. And then he got emotional and he looked at us and he said, listen, he said, the thing that you don't understand is that we were in a really bad place. Me and my girlfriend, we were in a really bad place because the neighborhood we lived in was a really rough neighborhood. And I don't know San Francisco at all, right? I don't know. I don't know where the rough neighborhoods are. I don't know anything about it, right? We were in a really rough neighborhood and we couldn't afford to move out. We were worried about our son going to some of the schools in that neighborhood because, again, the really rough neighborhood, The schools aren't that great. They don't teach the kids well. There are a lot of drugs. There are a lot of problems. And he said, I went from making $40,000 a year to making, I think it was like $60,000 or $65,000 a year. He said that was enough for us to move from that neighborhood to a much nicer neighborhood where the schools are better, the sidewalks are clean, we're not stepping over syringes, we're not, dealing with any of these problems. He said, you guys literally changed my kid's life. And he's getting emotional over the difference that we made, just a handful of us getting together every week and talking about code and having some lighthearted banter about whatever sci-fi show we're watching at the end for our picks, right? And for him, it was this big deal because it was an opportunity that he doesn't believe he ever would have had if we hadn't been putting out content that had opened those doors for him, right? I had somebody do the same thing with my book, right? So I wrote a book on how to find a developer job. I'm actually working on revising parts of it because I'm a little bit of a perfectionist. Don't tell my wife because I give her a bad time about being a perfectionist. But I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, so I'm revising parts of it. And there are things that I want to just explain a little bit better in it. And I want to do an audio book, and I can't read it out loud without going, ooh. Anyway, so I had somebody pick up my book, and they read it, and they had been struggling to get a job literally for like 6 months or 9 months as a developer, their first job, right? They'd gone through a boot camp. They felt like they understood technology pretty well, but they just could not get a job to land. They weren't getting anybody calling them back when they sent their resume around. So they picked up my book, How to Find Your Dream Developer Job. And they started implementing that stuff, right? So they updated their resume. They went and found a users group. They started a side project. And then they started presenting themselves in a slightly different way. They started doing the kind of research that I recommend on the companies around so that they could get in the door. And then they started doing kind of the backdoor process that I recommend people do, right? So instead of just sending your resume out to everybody, what I recommend in the book is you actually find out enough about the company that you can actually orchestrate a way to start meeting people in the company and, start getting within their orbit so that you can introduce yourself. And then, get some mentorship, get some information, and see if you can get in that way. And this person actually was able to do this with like 3 or 4 companies, and within 3 months had found a job that she believed she'd really, really enjoy. And all of a sudden, I'm hearing back she was able to get out of this dead-end job that she wasn't enjoying at all in a different field altogether, right? Because it was a career transition thing. And her life's infinitely better, Now, it wasn't the same kind of thing where it was, my kids going to a different school and blah, blah, blah. But, moved into a nicer place, is much more confident, is happier with her life. And, it's that kind of a thing where it's like, look, I just through the effort, pulling a few people together, I don't take credit for all of it, but, through the podcast and then through the book, able to move people up, right? And, for all the fun that it is to go and BS around with people at the conferences, to yak with people on the podcast, right? To learn the nifty stuff about machine learning on Adventures in Machine Learning. For all the other stuff that you get to do, I'll tell you, when you have somebody come up and tell you that you deeply impacted their life in a meaningful way, there's nothing like it. There is absolutely nothing like it. Yeah, it's been a huge blessing to be able to pay my family's living for 6 years doing podcasting, right? And I'm working as hard as I can to be back to that, right? Now that COVID's kind of lifting and advertising dollars are coming back, and I'm able to start coaching people, which is something I really love. But I have to say, I mean, the real big payoff is the opportunities where people are going, you changed my life, and we talk about code and technology, right? We talk about coding practices and career stuff. I never thought that people would be coming to me and going, I never would have been able to do this without you, right? I never ever dreamed that that would be the case. I just kind of assumed that in another 5 years that people would be calling me up to give the keynotes at the conference, and I'd be like, okay, cool. But I'll tell you, if you want a why that matters, go be a dev influencer and then have your first person come pull that. Have your first person show up and go, my life's different, right? And again, we're not giving them life practices, but we're giving them skills that allow them to open up opportunities in their life. And I never, ever thought about that when I started talking about Ruby on Rails on a podcast. But man, I can't imagine doing anything that doesn't make an impact on people now. So if you're wondering whether or not it's worth it, just think about that for a minute. And if that doesn't get you going, if that doesn't turn you on and have you going, yeah, I want to make that kind of an influence, then maybe dev influence isn't quite the thing for you. Maybe you should be looking at some other way to advance your career. But I'll tell you what, we help people. It matters. It's funny because I never would have dreamed it when I started, ever. And it's not why I did it when I started either, which is funny too, right? I started out doing it because it sounded fun. And I started out doing it because it opened a bunch of those doors for me, right? I mean, that's why I started out talking about the long-term career stuff and the short-term cool stuff, right? Is because those were the reasons why I was doing it when I started podcasting. But this is the reason I do it now, right? This is the reason why I'm doing the Dev Influencers Accelerator, is because I want to help more people. So anyway, that's the payoff. This is the why for me now. And, I mean, I'm not saying that the others don't matter, because they are fun, right? And I'm not saying that you're a bad person if you want the other ones more than you want this, right? Because that's not the case either. Everybody gets motivated by different things, right? But at the end of the day, different things are going to light different people up. And these are the reasons that I'm finding are the things that are really going to get people going. It's either because they have some long-term reason for doing it, right? Whether it's, I want to build this business, right? Which is the long-term reason. Or they have, some other, I want to show up and have these short-term benefits keep showing up. Or I want to make this long-term difference. So anyway, and maybe it's some of all three, because I have to admit, the other two, they still play a role. They do for me. But whatever your reasons, start thinking about what they are. Start thinking about how you get them. And then go to devinfluencers.com/apply. And let's get you into the accelerator and let's get this thing rolling so that we can actually get you there. All right, max out, everybody.